Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Oladosu Adenike, an eco-feminist, climate justice activist, and an eco-reporter. And my idea of a green democracy is the one that portrays not only a democracy of the people, by the people, for the people, and of the people, but it's a democracy whereby we include the voice of our environment into it. That means it becomes a democracy of the people and the environment, by the people and the environment, and for the people and the environment, because it tells it all on us that the well-being of our environment definitely affects human beings. So if we have a one-sided democracy, definitely is going to affect our connection with the environment, then we might not be able to respect the environment. But if we have an holistic democracy that now include the voice of our environment, then it becomes, we will now be able to take care of our environment as we can do to humanity, or to human as well, to see how we can all live together mutually without harming each other in any way. And looking at that of the Lake Chad region, why I portrays on a green democracy is the fact that this lake has shrunk. And because of we need a green democracy, it's going to connect the people with their environments. To see that as the lake has shrunk down below 90%, it is also affecting the livelihood of the people, which have invariably displaced these people away from their livelihood. So you could see that the environment has a greater impact on the human lives that live in the region from where I am from, of which the lake borders Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, and other Central African countries. So it tells a lot about a green democracy that we need to include into our decision making, into different aspects of our economy. So I'm also keen to hear from you as an academia.
Yeah, so I think in the academic debate, there is some thinking about ecological democracy for quite a while now, but on a very theoretical level. So there is only very few progress made really in concrete attempts to say, well, these are the institutions that are possible or able to, for example, represent the environment or represent the voices of the environment. There is a lot of academic debate at the moment about how to include non-human nature. And I think there are a lot of indigenous practices around the world where academia is currently looking into and trying to learn something. For example, where rivers or lakes become, in New Zealand, a lake and a mountain and a forest became, which is pretty new, I think, also in the academic debate about democracies, because so far democracy, and if you look, well, let's go one step back maybe and look at what we know so far. And there are ways where academia tries to put democracy into an index. So how can we measure or estimate how good a democracy is? And then you have a lot of indicators, and you have, for example, how far away is the next possibility for you to vote in elections? Is it 1 kilometer? Is it 10 kilometers? Is it 50 kilometers away? And so on and so forth. And so you have hundreds and thousands of these indicators summing up to one index where you can try to measure democracy. And if you then have on the other side, for example, in terms of climate change, a climate index where you can see, well, countries perform good or not so good in terms of climate change, then you can have calculations about, well, does more democracy lead to better or worse climate performance? And what you see there is that those states that are more democratic also do better climate policies. It's far away from being enough, so they won't meet the 1.5 or 2 degree target, but at least they are better than autocratic states or dictatorships. So sometimes you hear the argument, well, we should just have an eco-dictatorship for a couple of months or years, and then do all the climate legislation and all the climate policies, and then we can switch back to democracy. So it's of course a thought experiment, but the data says, well, this won't work, because autocratic states and autocratic leaders are very much only interested in staying in power for the short term, and not interested in these. A lot of arguments that support these findings, but as I said, it won't help to meet the 1.5 or 2 degree target. And
Yeah,
this is why
you.
now there's kind of
just to cut into what you are saying, that really, I know over time I've seen reports on democracy, but to a larger extent, looking at it holistically, that can you create this link between democracy and the climate change crisis? Is there really an impact or not? Because we need to establish this relationship, maybe over time, maybe due to conflict arising from climate change or different things. What do you think are this relationship between democracy and climate change? And how can we better it to see that we have our democracy be strengthened?
Yes. Well, there are shortcomings and advantages of democracy in terms of climate change. Ask the question again and then.
Okay, so thank you so much. You have made several connections, and we want to know the connection between climate change and democracy in our world today, because I've seen different reports on democracy. I want to know, what are those indices, or what are those factors that they look into consideration before looking at democracy of each country in relation to climate change crisis?
Okay, so you're interested in democracy itself, or in the linkages between democracy and climate change?
Democracy and climate change.
Yeah. So in general, you have some shortcomings and some advantages of democracies in terms of climate change. So the shortcomings are, for example, that you have characteristics of democracy like elections every 4 years. So if you have elections every 4 years, the politicians are interested in policies they can realize in 4 years, but not so much in policies like then. Climate change as such is a very wicked problem that democracies have problems to handle with. And then there are a lot of other problems democratic states have to handle. For example, you of course have economic crisis, you have other sorts of crises like the pandemic, and then climate change just becomes one of many other problems. But there are a lot of advantages democracy has. For example, if you have polls, they show that the median voter favors climate action. So if you have rankings, what is the most important problem for you? Most voters say, well, climate change is one of the very top priority issues. You also have a lot of improvements, democratic. There are these mini publics, you have town hall meetings, you have a lot of new procedures being developed to trying to deal with democracy. And if you look at the international level, then democracies are much more likely to cooperate with each other. It's a long, so to say, finding that democracies also don't go to war with each other, and autocratic states are much more likely, for example, to go to war. And the same is in terms of climate change true. So in general, democracies are more likely to cooperate. And shall I say something about my own findings?
Please.
So what I did Yeah, so what I did, I looked at all these different arguments and I thought, well, is there anything you can really show and demonstrate in terms of the empirical level? So not only having theoretical arguments going back and forth, and then you have this democracy index and the climate change performance index. And if you calculate them, you can run penal regressions, for example, so trying to find the connections between those. And then you see, indeed, well, more democracy leads to better climate performance, but not enough. So you can have more democracy and it has an impact. It's not a very strong impact because, of course, you have many other factors. You have economic factors. You have, for example, whether a country has gas, oil reserves, and so on and so forth. So there are many other factors, but democracy, if a state is more democratic, it's more likely that it's doing better climate performance.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I know democracy is just one of the factors that we can use to champion climate action around the globe, because there are different factors, different things that we need to use to champion climate action. And I'm now wondering that, can climate change end democracy with the way our systems are failing? Like, is it possible that the climate crisis can end democracy, can make it fragile?
Well, that's a very good question. I think what you can see is that if democracies don't act up on climate change in the next years and decades, it's very likely that extreme weather events and all these results that you will see from a more severe climate change will put democracy in a very passive role. So democracy has to react, because in Germany, for example, we had a great flood this year, a great extreme weather event, which costs to rebuild the region about 30 billion euros. So it's then just about, okay, well, something happened and we have to react. But democracy is usually conceptualized, thought of in its, I think, whole idea as a very proactive, because you want people to think about their future, to have collective processes that lead to realizing their ideas, hopes, utopias. And if you only have to react to more in a position where it can't shape future policies, because it is shaped by the planet and by climate change. So I think there is indeed, as you rightly point to, a danger that democracy will not be the same as it was or could be if we don't address climate change.
Oh, thank you so much. So it's invariably means that it's a two-way thing. Democracy should be a two-way thing now. And it needs an upgrade, like for us to upgrade our democracy to now include the environment. And that leads me to my next question. What do you think about a green democracy, ecological democracy, earth democracy in tackling the climate change crisis? Because I think we need to redefine democracy to not be only for the people, but also to include the environment, a democracy of the people and the environment, by the people and the environment, and for the people and the environment, just a two-way thing. So since democracy, climate action depends on democracy too, and democracy too depends on how we can tackle the climate change crisis. What do you think about green democracy, earth democracy, ecological democracy?
Yeah. Well, if you look back in the history of democracy, you can see that democracies always democratized, so they always became better when they included those who weren't included before. So, for example, when democracy started to including, when they started to including women, when they started to include non-whites in decision-making processes, they democratized. They opened up new possibilities of life for everyone, and they enabled more quality of life for not only a few white men, but for a much broader citizenship. And now I think we are at a stage where we have to think about, and this is something that became very much in discussion since I think you've realized that democracies have such a great impact on the environment. So since the roughly industrialization, and particularly since the 1950s, large parts, or well, I think you have to differentiate, because of course some Western industrialized and rich democracies have a much greater impact, of course, on the global environment. They started transforming the earth in a manifold way, and there weren't really democratic procedures that guided these interventions in the environment. So it happened a lot outside the realm of democracy. And so since a few decades, you have this idea of ecological democracy, of green democracy. I think it's really in the last few years turning up in a way that these theoretical discussions have to be filled and are thought of, well, what does it mean precisely? So what does it mean to include the environment? Should we have human representations speaking for the environment? Should we try to listen to the environment and include it in some other way in democratic decision-making? And I think this is currently a sphere of experimentation. And some countries experiment with giving legal rights to some natural forces like rivers, forests, and mountains or so, to get a much better feeling of how the manifold interactions between human citizens and, so to say, the non-human maybe citizens of the same region interact and how they interfere. And I think there's a long way to go, and there are currently only experimentation about this. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. You made mention of maybe the environment speaking for itself, and yeah, the environment has a voice of its own, and the voice is through the pandemic that we are seeing, and through different outbreak of diseases, trying to speak to us that it needs to claim its space. And in our former discussion, just to wrap it up, where you talk about Lake Chad that can act as a form of a legal form, and you also mentioned it just now about making our forest, water in a legal form to have their own legal rights. I think, please, can you just briefly explain or expatiate about what you mean by that?
Well, you have some entities in societies that have already a legal status. For example, companies have spokespersons, or if you have, for example, other, well, here you have, I don't actually know the English translation, but people who commonly own a house together also elect their spokespersons. And it's not the house itself or the company itself that explains and brings into discussions its interests, but there are representatives, proxy representation, it's named in academia. And you could think in a similar vein for a concrete lake like Lake Chad. So what if you don't have it only as a resource, but if you think about it as a legal entity with its own rights, where you have spokespersons that try to speak in the name of the lake, it's always complicated. It's incredibly complicated because you don't have, it's hard to really think of what a lake would think about. So thinking like a lake, would that be the role of the spokesperson, right? And to say, well, in political processes, in democratic processes, not only politicians should be involved, but also the spokesperson of Lake Chad, for example. And then you have, depending on how you design it, for example, a veto right. So the lake could say, well, this policy goes against my interest, I veto it. So please don't do it. And so you could find a lot of these sort of mechanisms where the spokespersons of the lake, based on, for example, also measuring the environmental quality of the lake, speaking to the people living there, fishing there, farming there, and then out of that, trying to represent the voice of the lake in a way.
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much, because we have gotten so much insight from what you have said with the connection between democracy and the environment, and looking at the fact that our environment also has a voice, and this voice have to be respected so as to prevent humanity, because the health of our environment is the health of humans. So it's a two-way thing, and democracy ought to be something that should be upgrading itself, just as it just mentioned, that looking at the history of democracy, they have to include the right of women. And once the right of women was introduced, it also helped to better the democracy towards delivery. And when Blacks are also included, it also keep improving itself, because once our system is not improving or is not being upgraded, it's going to definitely affect every areas, and we can't get a different result. It will still be the same result. So this is a call for us to have a green democracy, ecological democracy that could include the voice of our environment, so as we don't get to be affected. We saw it from the COVID-19, how it affected lives and livelihoods, and many are still reeling, like communities, like country, like mine, still really from the impact of this crisis. So thank you so much for accepting this invitation, and we really, really like it. And so you could also go read our article that we'll be writing together on the connection between democracy and the climate change crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you too.